All right, gang, welcome back. Here we are with Chapter 3, our second lecture for Week 3 of the course. So this lecture is going to talk about taking a step back and deciding how we should send the message, or if we should even send the message at all. So this gets into the planning and decision-making components of crafting business messages. You know, just because somebody is sending us a message doesn't mean we necessarily have to respond right away. So as a manager, I oftentimes would just get a flurry of messages and emails, and here's an issue that's coming up here and there, and sometimes you just can't respond to them all, so you kind of have to put out the biggest fires first. And what's interesting, one thing I learned is sometimes the messages I didn't respond to, they ended up sorting them, so the issue ended up sorting itself out anyways without me even needing to get involved. So the lesson there is not every situation requires our input, and there's a value in deciding when to communicate and when not to communicate. And you want to communicate when it's necessary, and you want it to have weight, and you want it to have meaning. And you don't want to ever communicate and make things worse or damage your own image and reputation when you communicate. So sometimes no communication is the best communication. And when we think about it, you know, there's a lot of contextual forces when we're considering putting together a message. What's the organizational culture? What's the timing? You know, I'm now working at a new college, and they have some different structures and ways of doing things. So even though I have a fair amount of experience, I'm sitting back and learning how they do things in this business department versus the one I worked in before, and kind of getting a lay of the land before I jump in and start being brassy with a bunch of ideas. We also want to think about the purpose of the message. Why am I sending this message? Is it necessary for me to send this message, knowing that folks are already receiving too much information? What's the right channel for this message? Should it be visual, a presentation, a video? Should it be written with explicit instructions? You know, if you think about it, something like folks being recognized for getting their college degree. What are they actually getting? They're getting the piece of paper that signifies you completed this level of education. Why don't we just email it to everybody as a PDF file? We could certainly do that, but that's not really the purpose of a graduation ceremony. The purpose of the degree and achieving the degree is you want to be recognized for it. You've been working hard for X number of years, and your family wants to come see there. It's about the recognition. It's not about delivering a PDF document to the recipient. So in that case, the correct channel is a live ceremony situation. And we always want to adapt to the audience that we're sending the message to. So we always want to consider who's our audience, and can we be sensitive to where they're at and what's their point of view. When I worked for Jack in the Box as a regional marketing manager, I was traveling a lot to different regions and presenting marketing plans and discussing sales of restaurants. And I would meet with different districts with about 10 to 20 restaurants coming together for that meeting. Many of the restaurant managers, English was their second language. A lot of them spoke Spanish as their primary language. And I'm aware of coming into that environment where here I am, somebody with an MBA, and I could use a lot of MBA language that wouldn't make sense, and it's really not necessary. So instead, I took great effort to actually type up my presentations, and I would send them to somebody in the office who spoke Spanish, and she would make sure that I had them correct in Spanish language, and I would do some of my presentations, or at least the opening 5 minutes or so, in Spanish. And that did well for me with establishing rapport with that audience. And then they'd always start speaking to me in Spanish rapidly. I say, no, 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 I can only speak what I spoke to you. I don't understand it as well as I speak it. But just the attempt of trying to establish that rapport, you know, as somebody who's white, male, coming in and, you know, to that environment. So that was something where I was considering the audience and trying to establish rapport. All right, so let's get into some of these factors around planning our business messages before we deliver them. Here's your key terms from chapter 3. Not too many terms, so this is an easy one. Again, always refer to your study guide, which has the terms that you're going to be quizzed on for that week's quiz. Your first quiz does start this week in week 3. And you can see your terms here. What you see on the study guide and here on key terms oftentimes are interchangeable terms. So this figure from the textbook outlines the 6-step process for planning and preparing messages. And I'm not going to go into great detail on this, but what's interesting to note on these 6 steps is that most of these steps happen before we compose the message. We actually don't compose the message until step 5. Think about how we communicate messages nowadays. Somebody texts you something, you text them right back. You receive an email, you email right back. It's oftentimes reactionary versus being proactive. Now, early in my career, I worked at an advertising agency, and that boss, Tom DeZino of DeZino & Partners, was a very feisty Italian man, and he was very controlling. And before we could call our clients as account executives and go over marketing campaigns and budgets and timings, he would want to see all of our notes before we could actually pick up the phone and call the client. It's my client, but you want to actually have me write out what I'm going to talk about before I pick up the phone and call the client? Yes, he did. Why would he do that? Well, he knew that the clients knew that when they get a call from the advertising agency account executive, they're being billed for that time. Much like if you've ever had to hire a lawyer, they bill you for their time. You're on the phone with your lawyer getting advice and input, they're billing you for that time. So if I'm an account executive and I'm calling my client and getting information and talking about the campaign, the client is looking at the clock and they're like, wrap it up. Let's get everything in this one conversation. And if I forget some things and I have to call the client back, the clock starts again. Well, that client's going to get upset that we're calling them repeatedly and asking them a bunch of questions and didn't get it all done in one communication, in one phone call. And we're probably going to lose that client. So he wanted to make sure that we had everything that we needed to ask of the client before we actually picked up the phone and talked to them. What do you want to get out of this slide? Most of your steps before you actually communicate with somebody are before you actually compose the message. So this is a discipline for us in the business sectors. We want to sit back and understand that when I communicate, it needs to mean something. It needs to be important. It needs to show that I'm professional with attention to detail and accuracy, and I care about my communication image. And you should care because that's going to help you advance in your career. You've probably received emails at work or something where someone tries to retract the message. They send an email out and there's a mistake. They got to send it back and redo it again. All of that has us, as receivers of the message, lose faith and confidence in the person who's communicating with us. So plan first, communicate second, or plan first and realize I don't need to communicate at all. So that's step 1 of those 6 steps you saw on the previous slide is consider the contextual forces. What's the organization like? As a new hire at Mira, Costa, I've gone and talked to everybody in the department, also met with folks who came from Grossmont who are working in different parts of the college just to get a lay of the land before I start emailing and communicating with folks. Because each organization has its own cultural differences and you want to know what those are before you start communicating. And these are some of the dimensions when we talk about contextual forces. These are things that can impact how your message is received. So, physical context is this a conversation that we're having in the men's bathroom? Or should this be happening in a conference room? Is this a little hallway conversation? Are other people listening? Or should this be a private conversation or a closed door meeting? Cultural context, what are the cultures, consider the cultural background of the person you're communicating with. Maybe your boss is a 60-year-old and they have a more formal communication style and expect some type of respect. My youngest son, who's 16, he just got hired as a checker or bagger, I'm sorry, at a grocery store. And I went in there with him before I had the interview, and we asked around to find out what we could about the person he was going to be interviewing with, the manager. And it turns out that he was a military guy and he liked the use of yes sir and no sirs. And so I coached my son. I said, when you go in there interview, you call him sir as much as you can. And he did. And guess what? He got the job. So these kind of things matter. All right, so that's contextual forces. The second step is we want to determine the purpose and the channel. Now, I already talked about channel in the prior lecture, which is which way should I send this message? Should it be email? Should it be face-to-face? Should it be a video? Should I fly out there and meet with the person directly, or can a video conference work? What's the best channel? And I gave you the example of folks graduating and wanting a ceremony to get their diploma as opposed to emailing it to them as a PDF file. So channel and purpose are very important in how you communicate. And these are things you do before you communicate. And what's the purpose of the message? That part is, why are you trying to send this message out? Do you want info? Are you trying to answer a question? Accept an offer? Deny a request? Seek support? So different purposes warrant different channels. We've probably had that instance where somebody's bits and pieces sending you a bunch of questions over and over on an email. I get this with my students a lot. And oftentimes I'll just send them a message back like, just call me, please, so we can have this conversation completely, versus little partial emails floating back and forth, which just gets everybody annoyed. These are the most common channels in business. It can be a written message. You know, if you need to leave a written record of something, when I went to Mira Costa's HR department and signed my contract, my salary contract, you know, that was written and I had to sign it, and the president signed it, and it goes into a file and I get a copy. So it wouldn't be something that's done verbally, right? So we need a contract for that. Sometimes you don't want a written record. Sometimes if you have conflict, it's better off to go face to face. And pardon my language, but if you're going to be an ass with somebody else and have a disagreement, why not go into their office, have that disagreement back and forth, versus having an email where you leave a written record of that communication and it's on the company server. Why not have a live conversation? You're probably going to deliver it in a more compassionate way, and it's not going to turn into an email that could come back to haunt you later on. Okay, so look at these three different scenarios. How would you communicate? Which channel would you choose for each of these scenarios? Your first scenario, you got to inform a customer of some damaged merchandise that's going to be replaced. Let's assume that it's important business-to-business customer. Second one, you got to notify somebody of they're being terminated. That's obviously very sensitive. And the third one, you have to inform employees of new internet usage policy. Which channel would you choose for each of these? The first two would most likely be face-to-face or at least a telephone conversation, since this is a sensitive topic and it's going to require some delicacy in how you communicate the message. The third one could be handled with an email. Now, if you find that you're purposely avoiding somebody on a difficult communication piece and instead sending them email or text, you need to go have the face-to-face conversation. One, because it's going to be delivered better, and two, you're going to develop your skills and muscles for those face-to-face conversations, which is really the realm of higher level management and executives. They spend most of their time in live meetings hashing out conflict and collaboration, so they develop those face-to-face skills. And the only way you can do that is by going there and not avoiding conflict, but actually leaning into it and developing those skills. So here's some other examples. How would you approach each of these situations? What channel would you choose for each of these? I'll leave you to answer these. So we determine the purpose and also the channel. And when we talk about channel, different methods of communicating, like a text or an email or a video or face-to-face, there's this concept of media richness versus media leanness. Media rich, and I mentioned this in a prior lecture, the most rich is face-to-face. This means you have all your tools: eye contact, vocal variety, gestures, touch, versus just a bulletin board on an employee bulletin board next to the time clock. That's very lean, meaning there's not much interaction there, right? So, but you want to consider, like, how much time do we have? Do we need feedback on this message, or is it just informational? Is cost an issue? Meaning, should we fly somebody out to try to sell this new product, or can we do a video conference there? Do we need a permanent record? If you're having an employee performance review and it's not a positive review or any performance review, you definitely want a permanent written record. If you're getting ready to terminate an employee and you're sending them a bunch of to-do items, please improve on these items by this date, consider this, you'd be putting on notice, an email, where there's a permanent written record. So as I mentioned, email by nature does leave a permanent record, and that's oftentimes a reason to not use email. Even if somebody sends you an email, if it's something like, this is kind of delicate, we're talking about some other employee here, or we're going to have a disagreement, don't use email. Don't use email. Instead, go and talk to that person face to face. You could email them back and say, let's book some time to talk about this. I think it's important that we meet face to face. And then go have that conversation. We get in the habit of somebody sends us communication in one format and we respond back in that format. Just because somebody emails you doesn't mean you have to email back. Protect yourself. Know that when you send an email, you're handing a football to somebody else. And if that email contains confidential, personal information, stuff that you wouldn't want everybody to know, you've handed that football to somebody else. And I have an example of this when I worked at Petco. We had an employee that sadly we had to terminate. She came from an acquisition of a small chain out in the Midwest. She wasn't performing well, couldn't handle the bunch of the marketing components that we had. And the regional staff was complaining about her, and my boss, the VP of marketing, said, we need to terminate her. You need to start documenting where she's not meeting her performance criteria and copy me on those emails. And so I did. Every time I would email this person, here's what you need to do by these and these dates, and they were getting more and more kind of strict, I would copy my boss on that. Well, unfortunately, my boss, being older, he wasn't that technologically savvy, and he would reply to me from time to time, make sure she also does this and make sure she always does that. And one time he hit reply all. So I had sent a message to that employee and blind carbon copy BCC'd my boss, and then he replied all back, meaning she got not only my stuff but his comments about her, and now she knows that I'm copying my boss and that she's down the road of getting fired. So you want to be careful about leaving a permanent record. Step 3, envision that audience. You want to improve goodwill, you want to build rapport, and you want to maintain credibility as the communicator with your audience. You consider their age, their economics, how much education do they have, what's their cultural backgrounds. I gave you the example of Jack in the Box and me putting together that presentation in Spanish with the goal to understand their culture, develop rapport, and understand the educational and occupational background of the audience. So we always want to keep the audience in mind. Don't try to talk above the audience or below the audience. Meet the audience where they're at their level. And then we adapt the message to the audience's needs and concerns. So what is the audience concerned about? What is important to them? If this was the very first lecture, me welcoming you to this course, and you're listening to my opening lecture, welcome to the course, You want me to convey some energy. You want me to convey that I'm supportive of students. You want to have clear understanding of how hard is this class going to be, and is he like a really hard grader, and is he a real serious instructor, or is he somebody that I think I can, get along with and work with? Do I want to take this class with him or not? So I'd want to be aware of that as I put together that communication message. So this slide shows the difference between I-centered statements or you-centered statements. So when you're focusing on the audience's point of view, particularly if you're doing a persuasive message and trying to sell something, you want to be you-focused. You want to be you-focused. So instead of saying, I want to congratulate you on your award, hey, congratulations, you are the employee of the year. Please send me. And you've earned an extra day of vacation. So make it you-centered language versus I-centered language. Also in step 4, it's important that we communicate ethically and responsibly, be truthful in your information. So this is very important when we get into marketing. This isn't a marketing class, but we want to be careful that you don't exaggerate the facts. You want to be honest in the language that you use and not use a bunch of hyperbole and overblown language. So this step is really going to come into play when we start talking about the persuasive message, and I'll be elaborating on this further in that message. Then in step 5, again, we still haven't sent the message out. We're still kind of figuring out how to tweak this message. Think about how much time you would spend on little things. You have to weigh what messages are important that really require me to kind of go through these steps versus is this just an informal coworker and we're meeting over our lunch break and we're chatting about business a little bit. Well, that's different. But always remember this, you're at work. You're at work, and why are we at work? We're at work to make money and advance our career. We want to keep our professional image intact. And so consider each communication with that fact that you are at work when you're doing that. So step 5 is outlining. And I gave you the example of my advertising agency boss who required to see our speaking points and our outlines before we could pick up the phone and call the client. So you want to, before you write the message, you want to structure the message, and outlining can help you do this. We also call this scaffolding. What's my main idea and what are my supporting points in putting together my ideas? And you'll write a more concise message. We're going to build on this more when we get into the written messages. That's still a couple weeks out in the course. One thing that I do want you to get, so pretend there's a light bulb on the slide, I couldn't fit it in there, is the understanding of the deductive versus the inductive approach. So the deductive approach means the audience that's receiving your message is not going to be unhappy to receive that message. They're going to be happy to receive it, like, hey, we're making our year-end bonus. You're getting a bonus. They're going to be happy about that. Or at the worst case scenario, they're going to be neutral. And they're an employee of yours, like, I need you to complete this survey about what we want to do for the holiday Christmas party. They're going to be neutral at the worst, neutral at the best, very excited to receive that news. So when the audience is pleased or interested in the message, you can get right to the point. You wouldn't want to, if you were announcing that employees were getting a year-end bonus, you wouldn't want to open that message by saying, due to the company's financial performance this quarter, we have exceeded our sales goals, paragraph 2, and in order to improve employee morale and align with our company objectives of profit sharing, we are pleased to announce that we are giving you a year-end bonus. No, you wouldn't need to do that. You would just open up the message by something along the lines of, congratulations, you're getting a year-end bonus. You can get straight to the point. You can state the main point right out of the gate. That's the deductive approach. And we use that when the audience is going to be pleased to receive the message. More often, however, we have to use the inductive approach. And that's when the audience is not going to be happy or disinterested or to receive the message. Sales messages. Hey, do you have a moment to talk about your travel needs? If somebody calls you on the phone or they're stopping you in a store and trying to sell you something, you're going to be resistant already. So with those situations, which would be persuasive messages, or also when you have to deliver bad news to a customer, denying a credit request, or maybe they want a product replacement, anything where you have to say no to a customer is going to be the inductive approach because they're going to be displeased. So you got to go through a few more steps for those situations. These are our written messages. We're going to have a persuasive, we're going to have a bad news, and we're going to have what I call a direct request, which is the deductive approach. You can see these in figure 3.3 of your textbook as well. All right, so let's close up with our last couple of slides with a pop quiz. So going back to context, because these might show up on a quiz for you. So in the dimension of context, the difference between communication patterns of men and women is attributed to the, which context would it be? Is it space and time, which is chronological? Is it social, meaning what kind of environment? Are we at work? Are we after work? Is it physical, the proximity to somebody else? No, this one would be C, cultural context. Culturally, the way men and women are raised has resulted in some different communication patterns between the two. How about this one? Which of the following is most true of face-to-face communication? Is it A, increases the chance of processing, remembering a long and complex message? Is it B, it includes nonverbal information in addition to that's provided in written or oral form? Is it C, it provides fewer opportunities to facilitate feedback and establish a personal focus? Or is it D, facilitates greater control over a message than written communication? Well, we can kind of deduce that it wouldn't be A or D, right? Because a long and complex message is not going to be remembered in a face-to-face meeting, and that's better served by a written message. And a written message is going to have a lot more control over the message than the free-flowing live conversation you might have with somebody else. So if you need it to be A or D, you would not choose a face-to-face communication channel. And that leaves us with B or C. And certainly C doesn't make sense, that a face-to-face communication does provide more opportunities for feedback and to establish a personal focus because you're interacting with somebody live. So the correct answer here is B. How about this one? Written defamatory remarks are referred to as? This one we didn't cover directly in the lecture slides, but that's A, libel. Libel is written, slander is spoken. Organizing a message before writing it will, is it A, B, C, or D? And the correct answer here is C. It ensures that ideas are presented clearly and logically. All right, folks, that's the end. Chapter 3. Thanks for listening. You can proceed with your first quiz. Good luck. Bye-bye.